He was born to rule kingdoms, yet his heart bowed to only one man. King James I, sovereign of England and Scotland, carried crowns heavy with history, but his most powerful devotion was not to thrones or armies. It was to George Villiers, the man who became the light in his lonely royal world. Their bond defied court whispers, church judgment, and the weight of empire. To James, Villiers was not a subject but a soulmate, a love written not in royal decrees but in longing glances, heartfelt letters, and a loyalty that outshone power itself. When King James VI of Scotland inherited the throne as an infant, the world imagined a destiny shaped only by crowns, councils, and politics. Few could have predicted that behind the powerful facade of a monarch destined to unite two kingdoms, there would grow a heart more vulnerable than most rulers ever dared to be. James's childhood shaped that heart. He was not raised in warmth or affection, nor surrounded by gentle loyalty. Instead, he was raised in cold stone halls where trust was rare and danger waited in shadows. His mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was forced from the throne when he was just a baby and sent into imprisonment far away. James never saw the tender comfort of a mother's touch, nor the soft reassurance most children receive freely. He was raised by nobles who saw him not as a child, but as a future instrument of power. In those early years, James read books instead of feeling hugs, studied scripture instead of hearing lullabies. His closest companions were tutors and guards, not friends. He watched powerful men betray each other again and again, learned that loyalty could be bought and sold like cattle, and understood far too young that love could be a weakness used as a weapon. So he armored himself with intellect, gathering knowledge like a fortress around his heart. But even knowledge could not fully protect him from loneliness. It followed him like a cold mist through the corridors of Stirling Castle and Holyrood. The absence of affection carved a quiet hunger inside him, a hunger not for power, which he already held by birthright, but for someone who would look at him not as a king, but simply as a man. When James grew into his role as king, first in Scotland and later in England as James I, he carried this longing with him. He filled his court with scholars and poets, surrounding himself with minds he admired. He encouraged art, literature, and learning because books had been his first companions, and ideas never betrayed him the way people once had. Yet even in the company of brilliant thinkers, the palace halls echoed with emptiness. A king could command armies and reshape nations, but he could not summon real companionship with mere decree. James married Anne of Denmark to secure alliances and heirs, and together they built a royal family. They had children, attended ceremonies, and presented a picture of royal harmony to the world. But marriage in royal courts was often a political transaction, not a union of soul and heart. Anne and James respected each other. At times they even shared warmth and understanding, but she could not fill the void that had been carved in his heart since childhood. He needed more than duty and dignity. He needed someone who would see him not as a monarch crafted by fate, but as a man scarred by isolation and longing for genuine affection. That loneliness clung to him even as he crossed into England in 1603, inheriting the English crown after the death of Queen Elizabeth I. His entry into London was triumphant, his future dazzling. He was now ruler of two great kingdoms, the first monarch to unite Scotland and England under one crown. But behind the cheers of roaring crowds and the glittering coronation ceremonies, the same quiet ache remained. He commanded nations, yet he had never truly been loved for who he was beneath the royal mantle. Fate, however, has a way of revealing unexpected truths when least anticipated. And for James, fate came in the form of men who entered his life not through arranged alliances, but through personal connection. Before George Villiers, there had been Robert Carr, young, handsome, and charismatic. James found in him a companion who provided comfort, admiration, and loyalty. Carr listened when others demanded, soothed when others stirred turmoil. He became James's favorite, rising through courtly ranks not only through the king's affection but also through his own charm and ambition. Yet even in Carr, the king discovered cracks. Carr was drawn to power as much as to James himself. The relationship served both affection and ambition, and as scandals erupted around Carr, James found himself betrayed again. Not fully, not dramatically, but in the subtle way affection can fade when ambition overshadows devotion. Carr's fall from grace broke more than the political balance at court. It reopened the wound James had tried to hide. Once again, he felt the sting of trusting someone who could not be fully trusted in return. It was during this, vulnerable period that George Villiers appeared. Figure who would alter the rhythm of the king's heart in ways no one had before. Villiers was unlike the courtiers who filled the palace halls seeking favor. He was graceful, strikingly beautiful, and possessed a natural elegance that caught attention without trying. His eyes held softness rather than calculation, and his presence carried warmth rather than arrogance. At first, James thought he was simply another courtly figure, a young man poised to climb the ladder through charm. But what set Villiers apart was not merely his beauty or charm, it was the sincerity behind it. He approached the king not with schemes, but with a gentle openness that disarmed James. Villiers did not see a ruler towering above the world. He saw a human being beneath the layers of ritual and command. He spoke to James with respect but also with softness, the tone one uses not for a sovereign but for someone they genuinely admire. And for the first time in many years, James felt seen not as a king to be pleased, but as a man to be understood. Their bond grew slowly, like dawn rising over a cold winter landscape. First came shared conversations, quiet exchanges when the court was loud with demands and politics. Villiers listened deeply, laughed genuinely, and offered reassurance without flattery. Then came trust, not rushed but formed through small moments where James could lean without fear of falling. And soon came something rarer, something James had never been granted freely in all his years wearing crowns, affection that expected nothing in return. Villiers stood beside James not to secure power or titles, but because something in his heart answered the king's loneliness with warmth. As their closeness deepened, the whispers at court sharpened as whispers always do. Nobles, clerics, and foreign ambassadors cast suspicious glances, some jealous, some alarmed. Power, after all, is a dangerous currency, and kings who love are kings who risk. But James was no longer a child guarded by strangers or a young king afraid of losing allies. He had spent a lifetime learning the cost of withholding love, the pain of living behind walls built by duty and fear. This time he would not surrender the one thing that offered solace. And so Villiers rose, not merely by royal decree, but through the affection that tied the king's heart to his. Titles followed love, not the other way around, and George became Duke of Buckingham, the most trusted man in the kingdom. Yet despite the political elevation, what mattered most was never crown or title. What mattered were the moments between them, the quiet talks beside the fireplace, the long glances during ceremonies where the world receded and only the two remained aware of each other, the letters filled with sincerity that survived centuries. In those writings, James poured emotions he had long buried. He called Villiers my sweet child and my nearest heart, expressions not of royal command but of personal vulnerability. These were not strategic alliances or calculated partnerships. They were expressions of a heart finally allowed to speak. Villiers, in return, addressed James with devotion that exceeded duty. His letters echoed admiration, loyalty, and tenderness, building a bridge between king and companion that politics could not understand and history would struggle to define. Their relationship, like all human bonds, faced conflict. At times jealousy flared, at times separation pained them, and at times the burden of empire weighed too heavily even for affection to carry lightly. But unlike the fleeting alliances James had endured in the past, this love did not fade with scandal or crumble under ambition. It endured, balanced between power and tenderness, loyalty and vulnerability. In Villiers, James did not simply find companionship, he found peace. The boy who once walked castle corridors lost in loneliness grew into a man who held someone's hand and believed, for the first time, that love could be a source of strength rather than weakness. Part 1 ends here. The king changed not by battles or treaties, but by the quiet revolution of finding someone who filled the void the crown never could. James had built a kingdom, but now he began building something rarer, a bond that would shape his reign, his legacy, and his heart forever. When word spread through the royal court that George Villiers had become the king's favorite, the halls of Whitehall trembled with quiet fury. Nobles who once maneuvered for influence found themselves suddenly overshadowed by a young man who possessed no ancient family power, no intellectual prestige, no battlefield heroics. What he held instead was something far more potent, the king's heart. And in a court where ambition simmered beneath polished manners, nothing provoked more fear or envy. Some whispered that Villiers enchanted the king like a figure from a tragic romance. Others insisted he manipulated him with calculated charm. But the truth was simpler and infinitely rarer. Affection had found its way into a life where affection had always been denied. James had been surrounded by advisors, servants, and counselors since infancy, but true companionship had been a stranger to him. Now, with Villiers beside him, he felt less like a crowned prisoner and more like a man finally allowed to breathe. Villiers remained attentive, gentle, and protective of the king. He handled court politics delicately at first, stepping into influence not with force but with grace, easing into responsibilities without arrogance, and James rewarded this sincerity with trust so deep that even ministers and generals who served him for decades could not match it. As years passed, Villiers's power grew, not because he seized it, but because James offered it freely, as someone who gives sunlight to the only flower blooming in a long barren garden. Yet power always brings storms. Those uncomfortable with Villiers' rise whispered against him, plotting subtle ways to weaken the bond. They pointed to foreign ambassadors and warned that England's rivals laughed at a king ruled by affection. They murmured to Parliament that Villiers threatened balance in governance, that he was too young, too beautiful, too close. They even turned to the Queen, Anne of Denmark, urging her to resent Villiers's presence, hoping jealousy would tear the king's private world apart. But Anne, wiser than many assumed, chose dignity instead of rivalry. She recognized that James's heart had always been wounded and that Villiers offered him something she could not: emotional safety. She held her respect intact, raising her children, fulfilling her role as queen, and watching the court's tension unfold with quiet resilience. She knew history would judge kings not by their jealousies but by their choices. For her, letting James have companionship was not defeat, it was humanity. Still, despite Anne's composure, outside forces pushed harder. Parliament argued fiercely with the king, challenging his authority, questioning his spending, and openly criticizing Villiers. Courtiers wrote secret letters filled with venom. Pamphleteers whispered rumors through the streets of London like poisonous fog, and foreign diplomats sent reports back to their monarchs describing a royal court divided not only by politics, but by love. James heard the criticism, but he did not bend. He had spent a lifetime surrendering pieces of himself to duty. He refused now to surrender the one bond that soothed his spirit. He wrote tender letters to Villiers even when walking into Parliament under fire, reminding him that external storms could not break what was built in quiet truth. He insisted that loyalty and affection were not vices, and if the world condemned him for loving, then the world misunderstood kingship as much as it misunderstood humanity. As their bond deepened, James and Villiers often slipped away from the noise of the palace. They walked gardens in quiet mornings when mist still lay on the grass, speaking softly about poetry, kingship, and fears neither man confessed to anyone else. Sometimes they sailed on the Thames, waves lapping gently against the royal barge as London's spires glimmered in the distance. Villiers would remove his gloves and James would rest his hand upon his, a gesture not of command but of comfort. There, away from eyes sharpened by envy, they were simply two souls sharing a fragile peace in a world built on masks. Yet even in these tender moments, James carried the weight of a kingdom. He worried about religion tearing his realms apart, about factions in Parliament sharpening their blades, about the ghosts of Scottish rebellions and English conspiracies. He tried to unite a divided kingdom, believing passionately in peace where others sought war. He sponsored the translation of the Bible that would bear his name, not for power, but because Scripture had been his only friend as a child, and he wanted every soul in his kingdom to access its comfort. Villiers supported him, encouraged his vision of a united Britain, and stood beside him in political storms. Their closeness did not weaken James. It strengthened him. For a king who is loved rules with more clarity than a king who fears every shadow. But politics, like tides, never remain calm for long. The peace James cherished began to shake under pressures from Europe, especially the question of England's role in rising conflicts on the continent. Parliament pushed for war. James resisted, preferring diplomacy and reason. Villiers, too, faced the gravity of decisions no heart could soften. It was during these years that King James aged rapidly. Once energetic and sharp, he began to slow under the burden of kingship and personal vulnerability. He grew sick more often, his joints stiffened and his body weakened. but his mind and his affection would burn still. Villiers noticed every change, becoming not just a companion but a caretaker, a shield, and a steady presence as the king's strength faded. He adjusted court schedules, ensured comfort during long councils, and attended to James with a tenderness that few courtiers could understand, because they had never seen a king held with gentleness instead of fear. Even then, critics called Villiers manipulative, accused him of controlling the king's decisions, painting him as a shadow ruler. But those who witnessed private moments knew the truth. Villiers protected James's heart, not his crown. He guarded the king's dignity when sickness made him vulnerable, and provided warmth when power made him lonely. In quiet evenings, when pain gripped James's bones and his breath came slow, Villiers stayed close, reading softly or simply sitting in silence so that the king would not face the night alone. James often whispered that he wished history could see him not as a monarch, but as a man who had lived, felt deeply, and dared to love openly despite the dangers it posed. He knew the world expected kings to hide behind armor and law, never showing softness. But he also knew softness was strength, the strength to trust, to feel, to give one's heart without guarantee of return. And he had given his heart, once filled with childhood fear and loneliness, to someone who held it gently. Villiers promised he would not leave the king's side, and he kept his promise even when it became difficult. Political pressures mounted. The kingdom expected decisive action in foreign affairs. Enemies whispered in every corridor. Still, he remained devoted. Their bond was now so visible, so undeniable, that even foreign monarchs recognized it. Some mocked, others admired, but none could deny that England's king ruled not from isolation but from connection. As James's health declined further, London felt the change. The once lively monarch who debated scholars and walked confidently among his people now sat longer on cushions, spoke softer, and leaned more heavily on Villiers's arm. His hair, once dark, turned silver. His voice, once commanding, trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes, whenever they rested on Villiers, still held warmth untouched by time or illness. And those who saw them together in those final years did not see scandal or favoritism. They saw loyalty born not from ambition, but from love stronger than the throne itself. James knew the end approached. He had lived through assassination attempts, rebellions, and plots. He had unified crowns, fathered heirs, and shaped the spiritual life of a nation through the Bible that carried his name. But none of those accomplishments mattered as much to him as the simple truth that he had not died alone in a palace built from duty. He had lived long enough to know affection, to receive loyalty untainted by fear, and to share moments of peace in a life otherwise defined by burden. As winter settled across England and James's body weakened beyond recovery, the court braced for the inevitable. Physicians came and went. Courtiers bowed with solemn faces, and the kingdom held its breath. Villiers remained at his side every hour, refusing rest, ignoring rivals who watched with cold calculation, hoping for political opportunity when the king passed. He held James's hand when the pain surged, lifted his head gently when the king struggled to breathe, and whispered reassurance when fear flickered in tired eyes. There were no crowns in that room, no thrones, no kingdom. Only two lives intertwined through devotion deeper than history could tarnish. The king's final winter was quiet. Snow blanketed London, muffling the streets in stillness. Inside the palace, warmth glowed from candlelight reflecting off marble floors. James often gazed toward the window, watching the snow fall gently, remembering the chill of Scottish winters from his youth when he had no one to hold him. Now in these last days he had someone sitting beside him, not out of duty but out of love. One night, as the air turned sharp and the palace silent, James rested his hand over Villiers' fingers and whispered that every king is mortal, but not every man is lucky enough to be seen as human. Villiers bowed his head, unable to answer through tears. The king smiled faintly, his voice barely more than breath, and said that he was grateful life had given him someone to trust. He closed his eyes, tired but peaceful, and drifted toward the end, knowing he was not alone in the world. As life faded from his body, England lost not only a monarch but a man who had dared to lead with intellect and feel with an unguarded heart. Part 2 ends here, on the edge of his final days. His story suspended between power and vulnerability, between duty and desire, between the crown he wore and the love that sustained him. When morning light crept through the velvet curtains of the royal chamber, a hush swept over Whitehall. Courtiers gathered in clusters, whispering beneath tapestries. The air felt suspended, as though the kingdom itself paused in anticipation of a truth it did not want to face. Servants walked quietly. Palace guards stood stiff and solemn, and from the chapel drifted the faint scent of beeswax as priests prepared prayers for a soul on the edge of leaving the world. Inside the chamber, George Villiers remained seated at the king's side. His eyes were tired, red from sleepless nights and tears he refused to shed in front of others. He held James's hand, gently rubbing his thumb across the frail knuckles as though trying to warm life back into them. The king's breathing came slow and heavy, chest rising with effort. The once resounding voice that commanded parliaments and debated scholars was now only a faint murmur in dreams. It was not fear that filled Villiers' heart, but a growing stillness, a dawning understanding. He had lived years under the harsh scrutiny of courtiers and foreign ambassadors, endured whispers of scandal and attacks on his character, seen plots form in shadowed corners of the palace, yet through all scars he had never imagined this moment. Influence and power had been consequences of their bond, not its purpose. Everything felt meaningless now, reduced to the simple truth before him. He was about to lose the only person who had ever seen him not as a court ornament, not as a rising star, but as a human being capable of loyalty and affection. Outside, church bells began to toll, not for morning yet, but for morning mass, a ritual the kingdom observed daily, unaware how soon those bells would ring differently. Ministers and nobles waited in the great hall, exchanging carefully measured looks. They knew change was coming, and they prepared not only for a new reign but for the quiet shift in power that would follow. Some hid eagerness behind somber faces, ready to cast off the influence Villiers had held. Others dreaded chaos, fearing political storms that often followed the passing of kings. When James finally stirred, his eyes opened slowly, clouded by pain and years. He looked not at physicians or attendants, but at Villiers, as though searching for an anchor to the life he had lived. For a moment his gaze sharpened, and he spoke in a voice thin as winter wind. "You have been my comfort." Villiers leaned close, his voice breaking as he whispered, "And you have been my honor." No proclamations, no grand declarations, just a man and a king, bound by tenderness at the edge of life's curtain closing. Hours later, the king's breath grew shallower, like a flame flickering under the last drop of oil. His eyes closed. Silence held the room. Then, with a single soft exhale, a life that had survived assassination plots, rebellions, political storms, and decades of loneliness slipped quietly into stillness. King James I was gone. For a brief moment, no one moved. Time felt suspended, heavy, sacred. Then a chamberlain stepped forward and placed a velvet cloth gently over the king's face. The ritual words were spoken in a trembling whisper. "The king is dead." Through the palace corridors, word rippled like a cold shock of wind. Outside the chamber, nobles bowed their heads, some in genuine grief, others in practiced solemnity. Church bells tolled again, not for morning mass, but for the passing of a monarch. London heard them and paused. People in the streets lifted their heads to the sky. Sailors by the docks made the sign of the cross. Merchants lowered their voices. A chapter of the kingdom's story had closed. Inside the chamber, however, grief was not ceremonial. It was intimate, raw, unguarded. Villiers leaned forward and pressed his forehead to the king's still hand, the weight of his sorrow no longer contained. He remained there long after everyone else stepped back, unable to accept the cold truth settling in the air. Ministers exchanged uneasy glances but did not interrupt. For all their resentment, they recognized the sanctity of moments where love stood higher than politics. Eventually, when the chamber had emptied and the king's body was prepared for formal mourning, Villiers walked slowly through the palace corridors. Tapestries blurred beside him. Marble statues watched with silent judgment. Chandeliers glittered as if the palace itself refused to dim, but none of it touched him. He felt as though he wandered through a dream where the world existed, yet life had stopped. Outside, winter air bit sharply at his cheeks. Courtiers waited for him, some to offer condolences, others to gauge their own future now that theirs was tied no longer to a living monarch. But Villiers saw none of them. He walked past the carriages, past rows of guards, past fountains frozen in the courtyard. He wandered the palace gardens, the very paths he had walked with James in seasons of laughter and peace. Snow crunched beneath his boots and bare branches hovered like skeletal memories overhead. He stopped near a stone bench where the king once sat reading verses of scripture, as Villiers listened quietly at his side. Now the bench was cold, empty, a relic of a life that felt impossibly distant. Villiers sank onto it, clasped his hands, and closed his eyes. The winter wind whistled through the hedges, and somewhere far in the city, a church choir began to sing for the departed king. In the days that followed, the court shifted like a river finding a new course. The new monarch, Charles, ascended the throne. Parliament prepared for change. Old alliances dissolved. New ones formed. Some advisors who had once bowed to Villiers now spoke to him with cool indifference. Power had always been a fragile currency in royal courts, given by kings, taken away by death. But if Villiers felt the shifting tide, he did not show it. He attended state ceremonies, bowed where required, and spoke with measured dignity. Yet through every ornate procession, every whispered conversation in shadowed corridors, a part of him walked behind the coffin, where memories lay like heavy stones on his heart. At the king's funeral, the cathedral glowed with candlelight, choir voices soared among pillars, nobles lined the aisles in black velvet, and Villiers stood near the front, his face a portrait of grief and reverence. As the crown was placed upon the coffin before burial, a final symbol of earthly power, Villiers bowed his head not to a monarch, but to a man he had loved. For years afterward, whispers clung to his name, some admiring, others cruel. History often struggles with tenderness when wrapped in power, unable to separate affection from ambition, unable to understand that a king could seek comfort not in conquests, but in companionship. But the truth lived quietly in letters and memories, in the gentleness of the king's gaze when Villiers entered the room, in the trust that endured storms and scandals and sickness. Villiers continued to serve the crown under the new king, but his eyes forever carried a softness that had not been there in youth. When he stood in council chambers, he spoke with a calm shaped by years at James's side. When he signed letters, his handwriting bore a slight tremor on days when memory struck hard. He never spoke publicly of the king in sentimental terms. Royal love, after all, belonged to private worlds, but in moments of solitude, he would trace the edges of a miniature portrait James once gave him, the paint delicate, the eyes familiar, and his breath would steady as if speaking silently to someone still near. Time, as always, marched forward. England shifted, politics hardened, storms gathered that would one day erupt into civil war. But somewhere in that long tapestry of history, a quiet truth remained. For a brief span of life, amidst crowns and councils and the weight of a kingdom, two men found solace in one another, not as institution and favorite, but as souls who met in loneliness and recognized themselves in the other. No historian's ink could fully capture that. No scandalous pamphlet could diminish it. Love, in whatever form it takes, resists the reach of cynicism. It persists in stolen moments, in letters signed with tenderness, in final breaths held by familiar hands. And so the story of King James I, so often dominated by politics and theology, holds another thread, one woven not into laws or treaties but into the soft fabric of human longing. He had been a scholar king, a king who sought peace, a king shaped by fear and isolation, but he also became something rare, a ruler who dared to care, who allowed his heart to be visible in a world that punished vulnerability, who found in Villiers not just companionship, but the dignity of being understood. History remembers monarchs for their wars, their laws, their crowns. But the heart remembers differently. It remembers the trembling hand of a dying king holding the fingers of a loyal companion. It remembers the snow-covered gardens where two men walked not as sovereign and subject, but as comfort and comforted. It remembers not the throne, but the warmth of being seen. And in that quiet remembrance, across centuries of shifting empires and forgotten battles, their story lives, not as scandal, not as rumor, but as the simple truth of two lives that crossed and clung, despite the weight of a kingdom between them. For kingdoms fade, power dies, and titles are buried. But the memory of love once felt endures. Stubborn, radiant, unchanged by time.